Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. And we're going to start things out with the next generation Xbox. As many of you are likely aware, at E3 2019, Microsoft revealed the first details of their next generation Xbox, codenamed Scarlet, although it was only discussed as a single device, and since then there have been numerous reports and rumours that Microsoft have scrapped plans to have both Anaconda and Lockhart, Anaconda being the higher end SKU capable of up to 8K, although we can probably assume most titles are going to be running at 4K at maximum and up to 120 frames per second, and also Lockhart, which would be the cheaper entry model device. But that may not be the case. Brad Sams, I'll link his video in the description of this video, reports that according to his sources there will still be two consoles from Microsoft, but in a slightly different sense to perhaps what we expected. So Anaconda, the higher end device, remains unchanged from Microsoft's original vision. It would be, of course, a device which is going to be aimed at gamers who are willing to spend, let's say, $300-400 on a console, and also will be powerful enough to play games natively at high resolutions at high frame rates, and will have shiny features such as ray tracing. Okay, let's glaze over that. The new console, let's call it Lockhart II, is going to be a bit different though to what we expected. So the original thought that many of us had, and the many reports that as well that have been floating around, was that we would have Anaconda and Lockhart, with Lockhart being basically a cost-reduced, lower performance model of Anaconda, or to put it into a simpler context, say PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro, or Xbox One and Xbox One X. So basically, that doesn't appear to be the case. According to Brad Sams, instead what we have is a device which is really low performance. It is basically enough to run the very, very basic code of the game. So things like maybe collision detection, that type of thing would be handled locally. But the actual GPU, for example, of the console would be very meager. And the reason for that is that all of that data, like graphics and much of the artificial intelligence, that would actually be handled via the cloud. So, as we all know, Google have been really pushing Stadia, and it will be launched this year. But Microsoft's approach, at least in theory, could present the best of both worlds. It will be more expensive than perhaps running something on Stadia. After all, technically Stadia can run on your cell phone, in other words there's zero investment, but if you did it on, I'm just going to call it Lockhart, you have some of that data being processed locally, which in theory anyway will have a couple of benefits. One, it will reduce the bandwidth needed for playing games, and the other benefit is that you will actually not need to worry about latency so much. Latency will be reduced. It will be very interesting to see exactly what comes of this when Microsoft does reveal the consoles, which we can presume is going to be next E3, although there are reports from Brad that we may actually see the next generation Xbox launch first in the Anaconda configuration, I suppose, and then the streaming only system launches later on. If you've been interested in technology, the chances are very good that you've heard of Moore's Law. The number of transistors will double in a processor every 2 years, that's the gist of it. Although that hasn't been exactly true over the past several years, as obviously things such as process sizes have become increasingly difficult to maintain the speed of reduction that we had back in the days, like back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And yes, I know I vastly simplified that for this video. There is one figure that's very well known in the industry, and his name is Jim Keller. He's worked at AMD, he now works at Intel, but he's worked at numerous other companies as well, including Apple and Tesla. So he's been around for some time, and he's extremely experienced, and also very well respected. He was actually one of the lead engineers, for example, with the AMD Zen architecture. But Jim Keller and I did actually get the opportunity to speak at GDC 2019. He's a really cool guy, easily one of the smartest people that I've ever met, and we discussed things like technology and computing, and also even a little bit of discussion on powerlifting, believe it or not. Yes, I can confirm that Jim Keller does lift. So, you know, not only does he lift IPC, but he also lifts weights. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. But anyway, Jim Keller recently was giving a discussion regarding Moore's Law, and the discussion topic was quite interesting. He believes that if you believe that Moore's Law is dead, well, you're stupid. He says, and I quote, "The working title for this talk was Moore's Law is not dead, but if you think so, you're stupid." He then basically went on to say that I'm not pedantic about Moore's Law talking about just transistors shrinking. I'm interested in the technology trends and the physics and the metaphysics around that. Moore's Law is a collective delusion shared by millions of people. Jim went on to say that tactics such as stacking chips are going to be what keeps Moore's Law, at least in spirit, alive. And I guess, technically speaking, he's right. I mean, from a literal sense, no, Moore's Law is definitely slowing down. But the spirit of it, I mean, if these type of technologies that we have now and that will be coming into play in the next several years would have been around when Mr. Moore had actually created this law, I'm sure that he would have probably widened the statement a little bit. So I think that in terms of spirit anyway, Jim is probably right. And now I want to finish the video off with some RX 5700 and 5700 XT stuff. So the first thing we're going to discuss is actually a leak concerning a price drop for the new generation of Navi cards. This comes to us through the website videocards.com, and we're going to discuss why the price is potentially lowering in just a moment, because there's actually been a leaked review of the 5700 and 5700 XT. We'll get into the performance in a moment, I promise. But let's first of all talk about the pricing. So the 5700 XT Anniversary Edition is going to cost $449 US. The XT vanilla card is going to cost just $400 US, so we're going to see a drop basically of $50 for that card, and the 5700 is going to drop to $349 US. Originally, of course, AMD were going to charge $380 for that card. So honestly, the 5700 vanilla doesn't get a massive cut, but the XT does get a pretty significant cut in pricing by $50 US. And that is, of course, because of NVIDIA and the RTX Super. In fact, it's quite interesting because back in the latter part of last month, I actually put out a tweet where I basically predicted that, at least in my opinion, there was a very good chance that AMD announced the pricing of the 5700 and 5700 XT at a higher price point than many predicted, because they knew that Super was going to be a thing. I mean, Super rumors were already leaking out everywhere on the internet, and I imagine that AMD probably knew more about Super than what the average person did online, so it would make sense to charge more. NVIDIA would counter by launching Super at the same prices that they have had, that we have seen them, and then AMD can then cut the prices down the line for the 5700 and 5700X. So what about the benchmarks? Well, the benchmarks have appeared on a Polish website. Well, I said had appeared because now they've been removed. I'm not going to go through all of the results, but I'll go through a few of them, although I'll link the article from videocards.com in the description of this video. But I do want to discuss some of this stuff because I think it's imperative that we take this into some context. So the first things first, the drivers here were not final. In fact, the drivers do not even support overclocking for these cards. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to see a frame rate of 70 suddenly go to like 152. But what I am saying is that these are basically early drivers that they've used for these benchmarks, and also it is only a single result. And we all know that, things can happen. Maybe the reviewer wasn't, the best at doing his job. I'm not saying that's the case. I don't know the chap. I'm just, saying maybe that happened, or maybe there was an error in the review. Maybe the drivers screwed up. Whatever the reason, it is only a single result. In fact, there's a couple of results here that I'm a bit kind of curious about, like the RTX 2070 Super doesn't look quite as fast as I'd expect compared to the RTX 2070 Founders Edition, for example. But let's just assume that, you've got margin of error of reviews and all of that stuff. Anyway, let's talk about the performance here. So, as I said, I'm going to cherry pick certain results, primarily focusing on 1440p, because I don't think you're going to drop like $400 to then play at 1080p. Some people will, but the majority of my viewers, I suspect, would not. So, if we look at the RTX 2070 Founders Edition, it gets 75 frames a second with Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p. The XT card gets 77 frames a second. I'm going to focus on the averages here. That's with DirectX 12 and TAA at what I'm assuming to be ultra settings. Unfortunately, I can't read Polish, so if that's incorrect, I apologize, and someone who can speak Polish can correct me. The 5700 scores 70 frames a second, which is actually slightly outpacing the Vega 64, and the 2060 Founders Edition scores 59 frames a second. I'm going to round frames up and down for this video though. So obviously that's much faster. That's not much faster than the 2060 for the 5700, and the super cards basically are neck and neck. Scrolling down to Far Cry 5, the RTX 2070 Super and the 5700 XT basically trade blows, 100 frames a second and 98 frames a second, with the 5700 Vanilla scoring 88 frames a second compared to the 2060 Super and 86 frames a second. Wolfenstein, the New Colossus and Mein Leben settings, we have the 5700 XT essentially keeping pace with the Vega 64 cards, although the 2060 Founders Edition actually outpaces the XT as well as the 5700 Vanilla. So the Founders Edition 2060 scores 104 frames a second, and the 2060 Super scores 109, which is not that fast actually. I would have thought that would be more, considering that the 2070 Founders Edition scores 116 here in their tests and 130 for the 2070 Super. We also have our other friend and buddy, Firestrike. Everyone knows Firestrike, right? Everyone loves Firestrike. It is, of course, a synthetic at the end of the day, but still, the Radeon 7 scores 27,450 points, which is roughly a couple of thousand points more than the XT. It's actually a little bit less than that, but still. And then the 2070 Super is 24,801. So essentially in this benchmark anyway, the XT and the 2070 Super are quite close to one another, and the Vega 64 and the Vanilla 5700 are also pretty much within margin of error with one another, with the Super being kind of close. It's around 1,000 points difference, and yes, I am rounding up and down here for my sanity. And obviously all of these cards are significantly faster than AMD's previous offerings, like the 580 and the 590, and obviously if you have an older Polaris card as well, like the 480 or what have you, there will be an even bigger jump. I also want to finish off with their power testing. This is with a i9 9900K. I don't really know the rest of the system configuration, unfortunately, but I'm assuming all of the components here were tested with exactly the same configuration. So the Founders Edition and the 5700 XT, the 2070 Founders Edition and the 5700 XT, basically identical power consumption. The 5700 Vanilla and the 2060 Vanilla score basically the same as well in terms of power consumption. I'm not going to quibble over just a couple of watts. that is very easy to make up with just by having a couple of extra fans and an SSD or something different in your system. So basically, according to their measurements anyway, the 5700 is a lot more power efficient than the 2060 Super, and the XT does a lot better than the 2070 Super. I say a lot better, it's around 13 watts difference between them. The value of Navi would have been quite different if Nvidia had not decided to embrace FreeSync, although decided to embrace FreeSync may be a bit of a strong term. It was more that they were kind of, well, forced to adopt FreeSync. Either way, the bottom line is that at these prices, I would be much more inclined to recommend the 5700 and 5700 XT compared to the original announced prices. I think now that we're looking at like, say, $100 difference between the RTX 2070 Super and the 5700 XT, that's a much better price, basically, just to boil it down and simplify it. I think that that's much more in line with what I would want people to pay for these cards. Now, at the end of the day, we will also have to wait to see more reviews, because once again, this is only a single review with very early drivers. So that we have to take into consideration. And second thing we have to take into consideration, let's give this review benefit of the doubt just for a second and say that the results are 100% accurate. Well, in that case, we still don't know what custom AIB cards are going to do, what room there is for overclocking, because they couldn't even test that, and so on and so on. So we still have some questions regarding the 5700 and 5700 XT. So I'm going to be very curious to see what happens when companies like Sapphire and Power Color, who are of course infamous for creating really high-end AMD-based Radeon cards, are able to achieve, like with the Red Devil and that type of lineup of GPU. So what this means is that Nvidia are forced to launch the Super series to counter the 5700 series, and AMD in kind are forced to lower the prices than what they originally announced for the cards. That is assuming, of course, that these rumors are accurate. So I guess the real winner here is us, actually. Surprisingly for once, we are the ones who are winning in this little battle, and that's great. It's going to be very curious to see if there is any rebate, what happens in terms of the, let's say the 2070 vanilla card, because we know that those are going end of line, and to see if there are going to be any like really large rebates for those. And basically it's a great position for us, and I think now if you are going to be buying a graphics card, now is probably about the best time to do it over the next couple of weeks. Hopefully we won't have to wait too long for the custom AMD cards to come out as well. So I apologise for not being on camera for this one, but the news emerged as I was wrapping up filming. In fact, I was in the process of editing, so I just can't be on camera for this one because I'd have to recharge the battery, and I just can't do it today. So it's audio only, but it is a Ryzen 9 3900X and a Ryzen 7 3700X leaked review from the website pcgameshardware.de. And this one's fascinating because, well, it gives us a really good insight into how well these CPUs perform in gaming. And that's really going to be the focus of the results I'm going to be looking at, because, well, we kind of expected AMD to do well in Cinebench. There have been numerous Cinebench results and all of these other leaked results, but games have been very much like, well, I guess it's going to do okay. I guess it's going to be better than, let's say, the 2700X. So now we actually have some really solid data here. So the good news is that there is definitely some improvements from AMD, but the bad news is Intel, at least if these results are accurate, are still going to have the crown when it comes to game performance. So let's start things out with Rise of the Tomb Raider. I'd have preferred Shadow of the Tomb Raider, to be totally honest, but there we go. So we have average frame rates as well as the low frame rates, and as you can imagine, the resolution is set to 720p for the purposes of putting as much load as possible on to the CPU. The GPU is using a GTX 1080 Ti, and obviously you can see the specifications of the system that they are using here. For example, there is no anti-aliasing or anisotropic filtering, and so on and so on. So, what about the results? Well, focusing on the 3700X for a moment, I'm going to round up the results and not say like 147.5 because, yeah, that's just a bit silly. Instead, I'm just going to say like 147 or something. So 147 frames a second average for the 3700X, which is definitely a distinct improvement of the 123 frames a second that they achieved with the 2700X. So the 3700X is noticeably faster, not much slower though than the Ryzen 9 3900X, and both of those processors are considerably slower than the 8700K, which is way north of 160 frames a second, and the 9900K, which is north of about 180 frames a second, depending on the consistent configuration. Switching over now to Far Cry 5, and basically the 3900 and the 3700X are basically identical in frame rates for many of these titles, it would appear. With the 3900X, you once again have a slightly better minimum frame rate, 64 frames a second compared to 61 frames a second, but the average is identical, 101. And I don't need to tell you, but it is also considerably slower than the 9900K, slower than the 9700K, and so on and so on. So basically these results are pretty much the same as the 7700K, which is not that great if you're looking at it that way, I suppose. But if you're looking at it as an improvement from one generation of Zen to the next generation of Zen, then there is definitely a large AMD have done pretty well. Like the 2700X in the same Far Cry 5 benchmark, the 2700X scores 84 frames a second compared to 101 frames a second. So that's quite significant. So if you were to look at 2700X compared to, let's say, the 9900K, 115.6 frames a second compared to 85 frames or 84 frames a second. No, I keep saying 85. That is obviously rather a big jump, but 101 to 113 is not that big of a deal. The minimum frame rate's low, 61 frames a second for the 3700X or 64 for the 3900X, going up to 71 of the 9900K. Yeah, that is definitely going to be noticeable if you've got a high refresh rate monitor. Wolfenstein, once again, 720p. Same thing, the 3900 and the 3700X are basically interchangeable in terms of the frame rate. So that is either good or bad. The good news is, if you are considering picking up a Ryzen processor, let's say you've got a B450 motherboard right now and you're just a gamer, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, I'm just saying all you do is game, you probably don't need to plonk your money down on a 12-core CPU. And it's also going to be very curious to see what the 3600 non-X is going to do, because obviously that is the cheapest SKU. Anyway, getting back to the results. So basically identical performance, the 3900X and the 3700X, 297.8 versus 296.9. That is margin of error stuff right there. And even the average, the minimum, 208 versus 204, which is actually slightly better than what Intel managed to get with the 9900K, which is 318.4 or 196 frames per second dead on. And finally, Assassin's Creed Origins, we have the 3900X and the 3700X actually comes out on top here in average frames a second. So the 3900X scores 95 FPS compared to the 9900K, which is 92.7. The 3700X and the 9900K, basically identical low frame rates. In terms of productivity, I'm not going to read out all the results because honestly, we've seen so many of these results actually leak online. We've seen Cinebench and so many other benchmarks that kind of have told us that in synthetic results, as well as most productivity stuff like Cinebench, and we can presume 3ds Max and video editing and blah 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 blah, Ryzen 3rd generation is going to kick butt. Now, this is based upon this one review, and once again, one review does not necessarily equate to a great understanding of the performance, but assuming this is accurate, what this basically means is it actually leaves Intel in a slightly better position perhaps than what some people had suspected. I did think that Intel would beat AMD in terms of gaming, although you can argue that you could get faster memory and maybe tweak things a little bit and that type of stuff for the game benchmarks, and that may improve things, and yeah, you can argue that for certain. But then you can also argue that you can overclock a 9900K, you can also argue that you can do all of this other stuff as well. So yeah, the 3200 megahertz memory, of course, is the memory speeds that is recommended by AMD. It's basically the officially supported speed. So you can't really say that it's terrible. I would have preferred to have seen 3600 megahertz or whatever RAM, but it is what it is. So I think that this leaves Intel in a slightly better position. If you are just a gamer that doesn't stream, then core count is less important anyway. And I imagine for those individuals, Intel are going to make a really big push now for gaming. In fact, I suspect Intel knew the performance of Ryzen 3000 for gaming, because don't forget they issued that challenge. I basically said, meet us in real world games. So what this basically means is that AMD shore up the gaming performance, so they're no longer that far behind. You've got to also take into consideration, these are 720p results. And, if you've got a GTX 1080 Ti or equivalent, so an RTX 2080 or whatever, I suspect the majority of us are not going to be like, well, I'm going to run 720p. Of course, there are games which definitely push minimum frame rates a lot more, and also a lot more CPU sensitive, such as Counter-Strike. So once again, this is kind of a small sample of games. I suspect that Intel will continue to push gaming as its main forte. Comet Lake will come out. Hopefully we'll see some slight clock speed increases with Comet Lake, and of course we know they're going to push to 10 cores. With any luck in the world, they will not charge a price premium for 10 cores. It will basically replace the pricing model that they have for the 9900K. And I know I'm saying exactly the same stuff as I do with the leaked RDNA/5700 review, but you know who is the WinRAR here? We be the WinRAR. With all of that said though, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you did, normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.